The cartilage in my nose cracked with a sickening snap. Blood instantly poured down my face, dropping heavily onto the oak dining table my late husband had built with his own hands. I didn't scream. I didn't fall to the floor in a weeping heap. At 65, I had birthed 3 children, buried a husband, and run a 200-acre farm through droughts and blizzards. A punch from my own son wasn't going to break my spirit, even if it broke my face. My oldest son, David, stood over me, his chest heaving. His hand was still clenched in a fist. Beside him, his wife, Sarah, wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. A second ago, her spit had landed on my cheek, right before David grabbed my arm and delivered the blow. Learn to share. Sarah hissed, her eyes wild with greedy rage. You'll die soon anyway. I reached for a cloth napkin, pressing it against my face. The pain was sharp, throbbing behind my eyes, but my mind was terrifyingly clear. For 3 years, they had lived in the guest house on my property. They ate my food, used my farm equipment for their landscaping business, and treated me like a senile burden. Tonight, when I told them I was selling the farm and keeping the money for my retirement, their masks finally slipped. Mom, David stepped back, staring at his knuckles. Panic flickered in his eyes, fighting with the entitlement Sarah fed him daily. I stood up slowly. I didn't look at him as a mother looks at a son. I looked at him the way I looked at a coyote caught near the chicken coop. 10 minutes, I mumbled through the bloody napkin. Sarah crossed her arms, scoffing. Or what, Regina? You're going to put us in timeout? I turned away, walking steadily toward the hallway. They thought they possessed power because they had youth and violence. They were about to learn what real power looked like on a farm. The disrespect didn't start with a punch. It crept in like rot in the barn floorboards. After my husband passed, David and Sarah offered to move into the guest house to help me. I thought it was a blessing. I was wrong. Within 6 months, Sarah was redecorating my living room without asking. She threw away my vintage floral curtains, claiming they smelled like old people. David simply shrugged when I confronted him, staring at his phone, muttering that Sarah just wanted the place to look modern. Then came the demands. They needed a new truck for their business. They needed me to watch their dogs every weekend. They needed my credit card for farm supplies that somehow included designer boots for Sarah. I never liked arguing. Shouting matches drain energy better spent mending fences or balancing the books. So I watched. I observed how Sarah commanded my kitchen, pushing my cooking aside to make her organic smoothies, leaving the dirty blender in the sink for me to wash. I saw how David parked his heavy machinery right on my prized garden beds, completely oblivious to the world around him. My younger daughter Maya lived 2 states away. She visited during Thanksgiving and immediately noticed the shift. Mom, you're serving them in your own house, Maya whispered while we washed dishes. Sarah just asked you to fetch her a napkin. You aren't their maid. I know, I answered quietly. Set a boundary, Mom, before they take over entirely. I didn't need to argue with Maya. She was right. The farm was becoming too much for me to handle alone anyway, and David was useless with the actual crops. He only cared about using my barns for his landscaping equipment. That's when the idea of selling began to take root. I didn't warn them. I didn't ask for permission. I quietly got an appraisal. But I knew the moment I cut off their free ride, things would get ugly. I just didn't realize how ugly. Before I even announced the sale, I began pulling the invisible strings of my life away from their grasp. I didn't need complicated maneuvers. I just needed common sense. One Tuesday, while David and Sarah were in town, I drove to the local bank. I sat with the manager, a woman I'd known for 20 years. I removed David's name from the joint emergency account. I ordered new debit cards and canceled the ones Sarah kept borrowing. I closed the open credit line at the farm supply store, ensuring no one could charge a single bag of fertilizer without my physical presence and signature. Next, I visited the hardware store. I bought heavy-duty padlocks, thick steel chains, and a new set of deadbolts for the main house. I kept them hidden under a blanket in the trunk of my car. They lived in the guest house, but they didn't realize that the guest house's utility lines ran directly through the main barn's control panel. The Wi-Fi router they streamed their movies on plugged into my living room wall. The well pump that supplied their water controlled by a switch in my basement. I spent days making sure I knew exactly where every breaker, every valve, and every physical key was. I moved the spare keys from the hook by the door to a small safe under my bed. I took the master keys to the tractors and slipped them into my coat pocket. Sarah thought she controlled the household because she spoke the loudest and decided what we watched on television. She didn't understand that control wasn't about noise. Control was about who held the keys. By the time Sunday dinner rolled around, the trap wasn't a legal document. It was a physical reality. I had prepared the meal a roast chicken, knowing it might be the last meal we ever shared. The storm was coming, and I was holding this umbrella. That Sunday evening, I pulled the roast from the oven. David sat at the table, scrolling through sports scores. Sarah was picking at her nails, complaining about the dust on the porch. I signed the papers yesterday. I announced, setting the platter down. My voice was steady. The farm is sold. Closing is in 30 days. You two have until then to find a new place. The silence was absolute. David dropped his phone. Sarah's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing into dangerous slits. Sold, David choked out. What do you mean sold? This is my inheritance. We use the barns for the business. It's my property, David, I stated, taking my seat. The money is funding my retirement. I'm moving to a smaller place in town. Sarah stood up, her chair scraping harshly against the wood floor. Are you out of your mind? You're going to take our livelihood and buy some useless condo. We need that money to expand. You need to pay your own way, I replied, refusing to break eye contact. That was when the dam broke. Sarah leaned across the table, her face inches from mine. Learn to share, she spat. The saliva hit my cheek, warm and degrading. You'll die soon anyway. I stood up, wiping my face, my anger finally flaring. Get out of my house. David lunged. He grabbed my left arm, his grip bruising my skin instantly. Don't talk to her like that. You owe us. Before I could yank my arm away, his right fist swung. It was a blind, angry reaction, but it connected perfectly with my nose. The crunch was deafening. I stumbled back, grabbing the edge of the table to stay upright. Blood rushed down my chin. They stood there breathing heavily, waiting for me to collapse or cry. Instead, I grabbed the napkin, gave them 10 minutes, and walked out of the room. The time for talking was dead. I didn't walk to the phone. Crying to an operator wasn't going to fix the betrayal burning in my chest. I walked straight out the back door, the cool night air biting at my swelling face. The bleeding was slowing, but the pain was a deep, rhythmic thud. I headed straight for the main barn. My boots crunched against the gravel. Inside, the heavy electrical panel hummed. I opened the metal door. The labels were written in my husband's faded handwriting. Guest House Main, Guest House Water Pump. I grabbed the heavy breaker switches and pulled them down with a loud, satisfying clack. Instantly, the lights in the guest house across the yard went pitch black. The low hum of the water pump died. Next, I walked to the equipment shed. David's 3 commercial mowers, his leaf blowers, and his expensive chainsaws sat inside. I pulled the heavy rolling doors shut. I took the thick steel chain I had bought, wrapped it tight around the handles, and snapped the heavy-duty padlock closed. I dropped the only key down the front of my shirt. I walked back to the main house. I locked the back door. I locked the front door. I slid the new deadbolts into place. Through the kitchen window, I saw the beams of their flashlights cutting through the darkness. David and Sarah were stumbling out of the guest house, shouting. They marched toward my back porch, angry and confused. I stood at the sink, running a cold washcloth under the tap. I pressed it gently against my broken nose, watching them bang their fists against the heavy oak door. "Mom, the power is out. Open the door!" David yelled, rattling the handle. I didn't answer. I just stood in the dark kitchen drinking a glass of water. 10 minutes were up. Their world was now officially shut down. The banging continued for another 5 minutes before Sarah's voice pierced the night. "Regina, open this door right now. This isn't funny." I flipped the switch for the back porch floodlights. The sudden brightness made them both flinch and cover their eyes. I unlocked the door and stepped out onto the porch. I didn't hold a weapon. I didn't need one. I held a small metal trash can and a lighter. "Power's off," I said, my voice echoing slightly in the quiet farmyard. "Water's off. Wi-Fi is off." "Turn it back on," David demanded, taking a step up the stairs. I held up my hand. "Take one more step onto my porch, and I'll use my truck to push your landscaping trailers into the irrigation ditch." He froze. He knew I knew how to drive the heavy machinery better than he did. "You can't do this," Sarah shrieked. "We have rights. We live here." "You are guests," I corrected her. "Guests who just assaulted the homeowner. You're lucky I haven't tossed your clothes into the mud." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the stack of plastic. Their joint credit cards, the farm supplies cards, the gas cards. I dropped them into the metal trash can. I flicked the lighter and touched the flame to a piece of junk mail, tossing it in. The plastic immediately began to melt, black smoke curling into the air. "My cards!" Sarah gasped, lunging forward. "My accounts," I corrected her again. "Canceled as of Tuesday." "But melting them feels better." David stared at the burning plastic, the reality of the situation finally penetrating his thick skull. "Mom, my business. I need the mowers tomorrow morning. I have 3 commercial properties to cut." "The shed is locked," I replied, turning my back to them. "Find a pair of scissors. You have until tomorrow afternoon to pack your house." I walked inside and locked the door behind me, leaving them in the cold glow of the porch light. I barely slept. My nose throbbed, requiring me to sleep propped up on 3 pillows. When the sun finally rose, the bruising had spread, painting the skin around my eyes a deep, angry purple. I looked terrible, but I felt incredibly light. At 7:00 a.m., my driveway crunched. Maya's SUV pulled in. I had texted her a brief message the night before. She didn't ask questions. She just drove through the night. When she walked into the kitchen and saw my face, she dropped her bags. "Oh my God! Mom, David did this." "He did," I confirmed, pouring 2 cups of coffee. "I'm taking you to the hospital and then we are dealing with him." "No," I stopped her. "My nose is broken, but it's straight. Ice will do. As for David, I'm already dealing with him." We walked out onto the back porch. The guest house door opened and David marched out, holding his truck keys. He looked exhausted, his clothes wrinkled from sleeping without heat. He walked to his heavy work truck, got in, and turned the key. Nothing happened, not even a click. He popped the hood, staring at the engine in confusion. I sipped my coffee, watching him. Before Maya arrived, I had taken a morning stroll. Taking the distributor cap off an old truck takes about 40 seconds if you know what you're doing. Sarah stormed out next, holding her phone high in the air. "There's no signal. The Wi-Fi is still off. How am I supposed to run my online store?" Maya crossed her arms, standing beside me. "By getting a job and paying your own bills, Sarah." Sarah jumped, noticing Maya for the first time. "This isn't your business, Maya." "It is. when my mother's face looks like that." Maya shot back her voice hard. "You have until noon. Start packing." David slammed the truck hood down. He looked from the locked equipment shed to the dead truck and finally up at me on the porch. The fight was completely drained from him. By 9:00 a.m., the reality of being completely cut off hit them like a freight train. Without my credit cards, Sarah couldn't even order a moving pod. Without the equipment, David's phone began ringing constantly with angry clients asking where he was. I sat in a rocking chair on the porch, a bag of frozen peas pressed to my face, watching the chaos. I didn't gloat. I just observed. Sarah stomped over to the porch stairs. "We need the mowers, Regina. David is losing contracts. We won't have any money." "You should have thought about your money before you told me I was going to die soon," I replied calmly. "Please." David walked up beside her, his voice cracking. "Mom, please. I'm sorry. I lost my temper. I'll pay for your medical bills. Just give me the shed key." I looked at my son. Really looked at him. I saw a weak man who only apologized when his wallet was empty. "Your business relies on my shed, my gas, my tools, and my land," I said. "You don't have a business, David. You have a hobby that I funded." "You're destroying our lives," Sarah screamed, her face red. I lowered the peas. "I am simply stopping my financial support. If your lives are destroyed because a 65-year-old woman stopped paying your way, then you didn't have much of a life to begin with." A loud rumble interrupted us. A rented U-Haul truck backed down the long gravel driveway. Maya stepped off the porch, holding a clipboard. "I rented this for you for 4 hours," Maya announced, tossing the keys into the dirt at David's feet. "I paid cash. Load your clothes, your furniture, and your dogs. Anything left in that guest house by 1 p.m. goes to the county dump." David stared at the keys in the dirt. He finally understood. There was no negotiation. They packed in silence. The anger had burned out, replaced by the grim reality of manual labor. Every time Sarah tried to sneak something that didn't belong to her, a vintage lamp, a set of my good plates, Maya was there, silently taking it out of her hands and placing it back in the main house. I sat on the porch the entire time. I didn't offer them water. I didn't offer a final hug. At 12:45 p.m., the U-Haul was packed. It was pathetic how little they actually owned when they couldn't take my belongings. David secured the back latch and walked toward the porch one last time. He looked at my bruised face, guilt finally piercing through his panic. "Where are we supposed to go?" he asked, his voice hollow. "That is a problem for a 35-year-old man to solve," I answered. "Not his mother. I am your son." "And you broke my nose," I stated flatly. "Blood makes you related. Loyalty makes you family. You lost the right to call yourself family last night." Sarah didn't even look at me. She climbed into the passenger seat of the U-Haul, slamming the door. She was busy frantically texting on her phone, probably looking for another relative to leech off of. David lingered for a second longer, hoping for a crack in my expression. He found none. He turned, climbed into the driver's seat, and started the engine. I pulled a small remote from my pocket. I aimed it at the heavy iron gates at the end of the driveway. The gates swung open automatically. As soon as the U-Haul cleared the threshold, their tires hitting the main asphalt road, I pressed the button again. The heavy gates swung shut with a loud metallic clang. I went inside, changed the gate access code on my phone keypad, and deleted their fingerprints from the system. The farm was sealed. 2 months later, the bruises on my face had faded to a faint yellow shadow. The farm was officially sold to a lovely young couple who wanted to start an organic apple orchard. They didn't want the tractors, so I sold the equipment at auction and added the cash to my retirement fund. I moved into a beautiful single-story house on the edge of town. It had a small garden, a wraparound porch, and absolutely zero guest houses. I heard through Maya that David and Sarah had moved into a cramped apartment. David had to take a job working for another landscaping company, making an hourly wage instead of pretending to be a boss. Sarah was forced to get a job as a receptionist. They were miserable, constantly arguing, blaming everyone but themselves. They never called to apologize. I never called to check in. I had drawn a line in the dirt, and they chose to stay on the other side of it. I stood in my new kitchen, the morning sun streaming through the clean windows. The coffee pot hissed cheerfully. I poured myself a mug, walked out to my small, manageable garden, and breathed in the crisp air. There was no heavy machinery ruining the grass. There were no demands for money. There were no entitled footsteps stomping across my floors. Maya was coming over later for lunch. We were going to look at travel brochures for a trip to Italy. I had the money, I had the time. And most importantly, I had my life completely under my own control. I took a sip of the hot coffee, feeling the warmth spread through my chest. I didn't need to destroy them in a courtroom. I didn't need police tape or dramatic legal revenge. I just needed to remember my own worth and lock the door behind them. And that, I realized, was the most satisfying revenge of all.